unforgettable attack on Pearl Harbor, as told from both the United States and Japanese sides. Once two nations made war. Today they have collaborated to make a motion picture of unequaled magnitude and importance, recreating the actual events leading up to the day that changed the course of history.
Tora, Tora, Tora!
Tora, 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 an unprecedented film, bringing you answers to one of the most controversial mysteries of our age. How could the attack on Pearl Harbor have happened?
Colonel, sir, if we do spot something, what do we do?
Report it to headquarters, damn it.
How, sir? We haven't got a telephone, sir.
There's a gasoline station about a mile down the road. They must have a phone.
Why was one nation unprepared while another was geared for war?
Why did the plan for the sneak attack split the Japanese high command wide open?
The fleet should have stayed in San Diego where it belongs. I made the mistake of pointing that out to Roosevelt.
Why was Admiral Yamamoto marked for assassination by the Japanese warlords?
Does anybody trust anybody anymore?
Why was the President of the United States office considered a security risk?
How did the Japanese rehearse their doomsday attack on Pearl Harbor?
Damn it, why can't Washington give us the full inside story?
Why did they keep the American command in the dark?
What part was played by the strange Japanese officer they called Gandhi?
How did U.S. intelligence know of the attack before the Japanese ambassador did?
What was the fateful blunder made by Admiral Nagumo?
How was a mighty Japanese task force able to race 4,000 miles across the Pacific undetected?
What caused the notorious radar error?
Yeah, well, don't worry about it.
Here's a message for the commanding general of Fort Shafter.
Is it marked urgent?
No?
Why was Washington's last urgent warning sent by ordinary telegram?
The sun came up, the bombs came down, and the world came apart.
For the first time, a motion picture tells what really happened
at Pearl Harbor.
Spectacular film ever made.
Tora, Tora, Tora!
Hello everyone, welcome back to A Second Look. You have just been watching a hyped up trailer to the 1970 movie Tora, Tora, Tora. The words mean tiger, 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 and that was the code for the final Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. A date which President Roosevelt originally said would live in world history, and it certainly has. At the Duarte Library just a couple of weeks ago, we were able to do a special presentation, thanks to the librarians, on Pearl Harbor, the Untold story. And some of those events we want to relate to you tonight in a more compressed fashion, because the movie Tora, Tora, Tora is pretty good in that it gives you both sides, or it tries to give you both sides of the story between Japan and the United States. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor was absolutely devastating. 5 of America's 8 best capital ships, we call them, were sunk or damaged. And of course, over 2,300 young men lost their lives. Strangely, there are still 300 survivors of the Day of Infamy, and how they love to go back to the reenactments. You may have seen some of the stories on television. But Tora, 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 that code word that launched the famous attack, unexpected, was the key to an event that completely changed this country, the United States of America. That's part of the importance of revisiting the story. Not many people know that before Pearl Harbor, the United States had an army that was number 16 in the world. It was as large as Sweden's or Ecuador's. Hard to believe, isn't it? But after December 7th and the recruiting lines, and they were open day and night, people wanted to get involved in the war. No more talk of neutrality. The Congress, the U.S. Congress, had felt like it was cheated in World War I. It loaned all this money to the British and the French, and it wasn't being paid back. So, you know, Congress, they can be pretty obstreperous. So they made sure President Roosevelt would not do anything that would get the United States involved in a shooting war. But in actual fact, the United States was already shooting German submarines in the North Atlantic, because Roosevelt knew that if Germany took over England, the U.S. would be next. But December 7 changed all of that. It gave the Americans this tremendous, invincible surge of unity and optimism. Frankly, we have not seen ever since. Even after 9/11, we had a brief surge of patriotic optimism. Then we started to fight about, you know, who gets what settlement, and which country should we invade, and should we invade Afghanistan, should we invade Iraq. It led to different results than the Day of Infamy. Like I said, the U.S. Army was 16th in the world. The American Navy had 3 carriers in the Pacific, and Japan had 11. 6 of them were in on the raid at Pearl Harbor. The United States had 1 Army division in 1941 against Japan's 100. But that began to change around when, as I mentioned at the library, the United States became like the 97-pound weakling in the Charles Atlas ads we used to see in the 50s, where this 97-pound weakling is being pushed around on the beach, takes a Charles Atlas course, and becomes a strong man. This is what happened in the United States in places like Long Beach and Seattle and all across this country. Turned out 296,000 aircraft, 102,000 tanks clattering off the assembly lines up around Detroit, Willow Run, and places like that. What the Russians really liked from the Americans, jeeps and trucks, especially those Ford and those GMC trucks that could encircle their German adversaries they were fighting. Oh yes, from a 97-pound weakling, the greatest generation was born. As a matter of fact, Tom Brokaw, who wrote the book, The Greatest Generation, mentioned not that long ago at Pearl Harbor that that was the day the greatest generation was born. And there are still, thankfully, 855,000 World War II veterans left, and many of whom will cut their eye teeth, of course, will remember the Day of Infamy. The United States went, as I said, from the 16th largest army to something like 12 to 14 million men under arms. All the result of one single day. One of the largest armies the world had ever seen. Indeed, only the Russian army was larger than the U.S. Army by the time 1943 and 1944 began to roll around. President Roosevelt said we must become the great arsenal of democracy. And this is exactly what the United States became. Some people who attended the talk at the library wondered what all this talk was about Make America Great. Weren't we always great? But when they understood how fast and how quick the Americans began to arm themselves and really began to take over the war by 1943-44, then they began to see things in a different light. But wars don't just start from nowhere. And in history class at Citrus College and in the library talk at Duarte Library, we sketched some of the background to the Day of Infamy, December 7th, 1941. And nations do have their friendly periods and they have their hostile periods. We went through the 1920s where Japan had felt like after World War I, when Japan was allied with Great Britain as a naval power, that she got some colonies from Germany in the Pacific, but she felt like she was treated like an inferior child. Japan wanted to make a declaration of full equality, that all races were equal. But the Americans and the Australians actually blocked that. And then, of course, came in this country the Asian Exclusion Act of 1923, where for 40 years people of Chinese or Japanese descent found it very, very hard to apply to enter the United States. And this was something that rankled and really irritated the Japanese. And the year before, Japan had to sign the Washington Treaty that set the limit of battleships at a 5-5-3 size ratio. Now you can guess who the top five were. It was the United States Navy and the British Navy, and the Japanese were relegated to this ratio of 3 to the other two great powers. So they began to feel like, they'd fought in the war and they'd transformed their country. In 1853, Admiral Dewey, you may remember from history, sailed into Tokyo Bay, trained his guns on the Imperial Palace at Tokyo, and said, you're going to open up your borders, you're going to trade with us whether you like it or not. Japan really took this to heart. Within 50 years, she was able to fight the Russians and defeat them in the Russian-Japanese War. So Japan mushroomed to world power, very much like the way she did in the 1960s to the 1980s. You got to give a lot of credit to the Japanese. They know how to turn things around and really get going. Well, all through the 20s, they were suffering their own internal problems. There was a great earthquake in Tokyo in 1924. 100,000 people died in that awful earthquake in 1924. The military stepped in to, rehabilitate and trying to get the country back on its feet. And this gave the army and the military a lot more clout than it used to have with the people of Japan. Now, later on in 1927, someone said Japan had a stock market collapse. The Great Depression came earlier in Japan. 1927, the Japanese stock market collapsed for various reasons. So the Japanese began to look around for ways to expand. One thing about Japan is it's not a country as rich in natural resources, in coal and oil and iron and forest as the United States is, for example. So by 1931, the Japanese, trying to fight off their depression, trying to sort of achieve equality with the former allies of World War I, they moved into Manchuria. We've got a map that shows Japan and the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. This set the Japanese on the road to great friction with the United States and the British nations. Now, if you look at the map, you will see the Russians were also trying to take over Manchuria. Russia is to the north of Japan. China, her ancient enemy, is just to the west, and the Americans had virtually taken over the Philippine Islands and others to the Marianas and some of the others you see there. So the Japanese began to feel encircled, and nations that begin to feel encircled, especially as ambitious and as able and as technically gifted as the Japanese, this is a recipe for trouble. So in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria with a hyped-up army, took over the country, developed it virtually as a colony. This was 1931. America was very upset by that, but not as upset as she was going to be when Japan joins Hitler in 1936. We had the Axis of steel, Hitler, Italy, Mussolini, and the Japanese forming an alliance against the Allied powers, the Americans, the British, and the French. The Europeans, too, we might say about that. So in 1937 came a move that would set the United States and Japan on a collision course for good. And we have a picture of the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. Now, it's hard to believe, but the United States has always felt sort of protective towards China. That is, up until recent times. You remember all the missionaries that went over to China, for one thing. And the U.S. and Britain and France, other countries thought China was this vastly wealthy country. All they had to do was walk in and get the trade barriers flowing. And so the U.S. began to feel a protection, an affectionate great uncle stance towards China. So when Japan invaded China, with all that that meant for trade and all the other aspects of national power, the U.S. really began to think, we are not going to tolerate this anymore. Now, we may have to appease Hitler. We may have to turn a blind eye to what Hitler is doing in Europe. But, you know, our Navy, and a man told me this who grew up in Oregon, he said, old naval guys in the 1930s would say, now listen, Sonny, don't worry about Japan. If they try anything, the U.S. Navy will go over there and surround Japan. It'll be all over in 2 weeks. Well, you know, we didn't use words like racism very much in the 30s, but this aspect of looking down on Japan and China and looking upon China as a little nephew and Japan as a sort of a strange, all of a sudden turning into a strange and hostile adversary, this does cost you in world history. And the U.S. Navy took a lot more than 2 weeks, as we know, to subdue the Japanese. Well, finally, in 1941, in July, the Japanese finally provoked the United States to take severe action. In July 1941, Japan marched into what we now call Vietnam. And the night that the Japanese invaded Saigon, a place we've heard about so much from another perspective, the night the Japanese invaded Saigon, President Roosevelt and the Congress drew up the Embargo of 1937. What was included in that embargo was something Japan's Navy and Japan as a nation couldn't live without, and that was oil, especially fuel oil, for the ships and for the Air Force that Japan had by now developed. So you'll see a picture of President Roosevelt probably signing that embargo of 1937. But from the day, the embargo of 1941, and from the day that happened, the Japanese seriously began to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. I'm not exonerating Japan, I'm just showing you can argue things from 2 different points of view. And as time goes on, we do see more and more evidence from both points of view. 1941, July, oil embargo on Japan. They begin to now make the final plans to attack Pearl Harbor. And so we have the pictures of the United States ships blowing up in the harbor. We have a picture of the Arizona Memorial, where over 1,100 sailors are still buried there with the Arizona. And if you go to Pearl Harbor, you will go out there on that little museum, and it's a very sobering experience to think that over 1,102 young boys were buried there in this ship that capsized. And you will see American veterans of the war asking the people that they be buried with their shipmates, those from the Arizona, as they began to die later on. You'll also see sometimes Japanese tourists bowing, very emotional, and saying, "We are so sorry, we are so sorry." Now, a lot of people talk about Japan not apologizing for the atrocities of the war and for Pearl Harbor. Yes, you have to understand the Japanese national character, but Japanese individuals, they do apologize. And of course, 4 years later, the Americans, by dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ended World War II, ended up as by far the world's greatest power. But before that, the Japanese were wreaking great havoc all over the Pacific. They went into the Philippines the very next day, December 8th. They went into Malaya. They captured and brutally mistreated people in Hong Kong and Singapore and places like that. So the Americans needed to do something, and this is what was good about the 2001 movie, Pearl Harbor. I mentioned Tora, Tora, Tora from 1970, but in 2001, Alec Baldwin and Ben Affleck starred in another version of Pearl Harbor, and I took a couple of friends to see that, and I said, you know, how are they going to make this a positive movie? Because Pearl Harbor was such a disaster, such a tragedy. Well, it was, and we're going to show you a clip from that about the Doolittle Raid. Before that, I want to show you something and explain to you something that hardly ever gets covered in the public press when we talk about Pearl Harbor. We're going to show you a picture of Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz is the American admiral who took over after Pearl Harbor. On Christmas Day, 1941, he was touring the harbor. He saw the 5 of the 8 American battleships sunk or capsized. He saw the damage, and the man who was escorting him, his helmsman, said, "Well, Admiral, what do you think? It's quite a mess, isn't it?" He said, "Well," Nimitz said, "I can only say one or two things. I can say either the Japanese were the worst attackers in the world, or God was looking out for the United States of America." And the young sailor at the helm, "What do you mean?" And so Nimitz began to explain some of the untold story of Pearl Harbor. It's scattered in different history books. You can find it. But for one thing, as Nimitz explained, they attacked on Sunday morning, 7:55. A lot of sailors, over 30,000 of them, were on shore leave or in church on 8 o'clock that December 7th. He said if they hadn't been in church or on shore leave, we could have lost almost 30,000 men in their berths. But no, the losses were severe, but not irreparable. Secondly, Nimitz pointed out 5 miles away are the fuel docks, are the fuel supply of the whole Pacific Fleet. And the Japanese got so carried up in strafing the battleships, they totally neglected or didn't know about the fuel that would fuel the American attacks for the next 3 or 4 years. So the dry docks were also spared. Because they didn't attack the dry docks, Nimitz said, "I can float some of these ships over to the dry dock before we send them back to the United States. And if they'd done that, we could not have got our ships back in shape so quickly." So Sunday morning, men in church, fuel tanks spared, dry docks spared, and the Japanese also did not attack the submarine pens, something else. But the greatest story of all, perhaps, is what Nimitz well knew, that America's 3 aircraft carriers were at sea on December 7th, the Enterprise, the Saratoga, and I think the Yorktown. The 3 carriers that would become the weapon in World War II were missing. This does fuel some people thinking it was all a conspiracy by FDR to get America into war. No, he wanted to get the war started in the Atlantic. He wanted to fight Hitler. Figured to get a hold off the Japanese with one hand. But no, the carriers were delivering planes to Wake Island and Midway, and they came back just in time. And as it so turns out, Nimitz was right. I'm going to now play a 5 or 6 minute clip from the 2001 movie Pearl Harbor, because every American should hear about the Doolittle Raid. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Colonel Jimmy Doolittle devised a plan to put 16 bombers on the carrier, the Hornet, which was in Norfolk during Pearl Harbor. 16 B-25s lashed to the deck of the Hornet would take off and bomb Tokyo. It would be only a pinprick, but it would signal to the Japanese that the Americans were coming. As Jimmy Doolittle said, it's only a pinprick, but it's right to the heart. He was going to launch 444 miles out of Tokyo. Instead, a Japanese patrol boat spotted them, and Doolittle had to decide whether to launch 620 miles away, and no one knew if it could be done. This is what this clip will show you, all the hurry and scurry of the American Air Force allied with the carriers. It'll show you how important the aircraft carrier is. And just think, this had not been done before. Bombers taking off from aircraft carriers, and it really adds to the drama. They have to strip the planes, put broomsticks in instead of guns. Let's watch this clip. It's pretty exciting.
Japs transmitting! Japs transmitting! Captain, radar reports Japanese patrol boats range of 400 yards. How many yards? 400 yards in closing, sir. Richard Japs, 400 yards. Let's go! Admiral Halsey's ordering the cruisers to open fire!
Gotta sink these Jap boats before they give away our position. Go to general quarters! miles away. How far are we now? 624 miles. What do you want to do?
I don't know. Colonel, I don't know if the planes can carry enough fuel to make it to China.
Now. We launch now. Army pilots, man your planes. Man your planes. They're shooting at us. These planes need more fuel, but if they're too heavy, they might not get off the deck. Listen, I want you to strip everything out of this plane you don't need, and I mean now. Start reblast, let's go! Add 10 more cans of fuel for each plane. Every plane. Oh, you guys get up there. Where's your suitcases now? What's your favorite gun? What? You wanna get off this deck? You give me one of those guns now! It's still too heavy! Yo, why don't you go to the kitchen, get some broomsticks, cut them down, paint them black, and bring them here. You're gonna put a broomstick with this gun loose. The plane's gonna be fine. Tell your crew to take a piss before I take off, and they're not gonna clear the deck. For tail guns, yeah. Maybe it'll scare them. You take care of yourself up there. Yeah, I will. Hey, be careful. You hear me? I will. I'll see you right. Right! Or you're tipping a sword! Superchargers low and latch. Superchargers are low and latch. We're full into the
Hello everyone, you've just watched a clip from the 2001 movie Pearl Harbor showing the Doolittle Raid. Every American should know about the Doolittle Raid. It was part of America's response to Pearl Harbor, the day of infamy, when those words, Tora, 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 were given. Every American should know about the Doolittle Raid. It was incredibly heroic. Every Christian should know that the Japanese pilot who led the strike on Pearl Harbor, who used the signal, Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 became a born-again Christian after World War II. And if you don't believe me, here he is with Billy Graham in Japan in the early 50s. Commander Fushida, who led that strike, went through a series of events that brought him to the cross of Christ, as he said, from Pearl Harbor to Calvary. Now that's something else we should not forget, and a great part of that untold story of Pearl Harbor. See you next time on A Second Look.